Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynica, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Friday, June 20th, 2025. This episode is produced for the Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Dr. Huseyn Aliyev, who is a senior lecturer in political and international studies at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And he's also an expert on armed conflicts in the former Soviet Union. Welcome, Dr. Aliyev. How are you?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. To start off with, can you talk a bit about your educational background and professional career?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm currently based at the University of Glasgow at the Center for Russian and Eastern European Studies. And previously, I was also a research fellow at the center, at a similarly named center at the University of Oxford. I spent some time at the Center for East European Studies at the University of Bremen in Germany. I have my PhD from University of Otago in New Zealand in political science. Much of my research before 2014 has been on armed conflict in Russia's region of North Caucasus, specifically in the republics of Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia. I've done some field work in those regions back in the days. But since the start of armed conflict in Ukraine, since annexation of Crimea and the start of conflict in Donbass, my focus has been mostly on Ukraine. I've done years of field work in Ukraine since 2015 all the way until very recently, mostly working with members of the so-called volunteer community, members of volunteer battalions, but also with members of the Ukrainian armed forces, various arms of the Ukrainian armed forces. Most recently, I was in charge of a research project on mobilization of foreign fighters in the former Soviet Union. So we examined pathways of mobilization for individuals traveling to participate in armed conflicts in the former Soviet Union from outside the region, as well as individuals mobilizing to join various armed formations from within the former Soviet Union. Also, obviously, Ukraine was and still is one of the places which does attract quite a few foreign fighters.
Doctor, Ukraine has a history of paramilitary groups such as UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, defending its interests at various times. Are the current Ukrainian paramilitary groups involved in the Russian invasion against Ukraine more active or less active than UPA was during World War II?
I would say there is a fundamental difference between UPA and more recent contemporary paramilitary formations, and I would probably need to explain what do we mean by pro-government militias or paramilitary formations in present-day Ukraine, and we probably have to go back to approximately April of 2014. Crimea was annexed. Separatist conflict was flaring up in Donetsk and Lugansk regions, and this is when Ukrainian government started assembling so-called territorial defense battalions, or as they became broadly known, volunteer battalions. So these were formations with very different names. Some of them were registered as territorial defense battalions or TRO in Ukrainian. Others were special police battalions. For example, Azov battalion, which was very well known at the time, was registered as a special purpose police battalion. There were other smaller units which were mostly very volunteer in nature. From approximately November to December 2014, Ukraine started to incorporate most of these formations into various arms of Ukrainian security forces. Most of them became parts of the National Guard within the Ukrainian Ministry of Interior. Others became parts of various brigades within the armed forces of Ukraine, so parts of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. So they were quite firmly incorporated into the Ukrainian security environment by the end of 2014. I think this is what distinguishes them from UPA and other historical paramilitary formations on the territory of Ukraine, which were sort of operated more loosely and probably had more autonomy as compared to post 2014 paramilitary organizations. There were some of the battalions, for example, various Pravy sector or right sector battalions, as well as Azov battalion, which had a certain degree of autonomy, especially at tactical and operational levels, but still they didn't have as much strategic independence as, for example, UPA or other paramilitary formations throughout the Ukrainian history. So I think the difference is primarily in the degree of distance from the actual state, and obviously in 2014 we had a legitimate Ukrainian state which was able to provide these paramilitary formations with various forms of support, because all of these groups were fighting on behalf of the state. They were fighting alongside the armed forces of Ukraine.
Are foreign fighters part of Ukrainian paramilitary groups in the Russian invasion against Ukraine?
Yes, absolutely. The issue of foreign combatants in Ukraine has been also always a very difficult topic. Since 2014, there were hundreds of foreigners who've joined the fight against Russia. Most of the foreigners from outside the former Soviet Union, they were parts of different volunteer battalions or different brigades of armed forces of Ukraine. But there were also back then in 2014, 2015, some distinct foreign battalions. There were two Chechen battalions composed mostly of individuals from Russian Republic of Chechnya. There was also one Georgian battalion, very well known Georgian National Legion. The things have changed a bit since full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That's when the numbers of foreign combatants have increased significantly. So, along with previously existing formations, which, by the way, have struggled quite a lot with legitimacy, because the Ukrainian governments, both under President Petro Poroshenko and President Zelensky, were not particularly keen on providing any sort of official status to those formations before 2022. But since the start of full-scale invasion, things have changed, and the numbers of foreign combatants, as well as the units and formations composed almost entirely of these foreigners, have increased significantly. So there's not only Chechen and Georgian battalions and formations, there's also a very large group of Belarusian combatants from Russia, number probably several thousand individuals, as well as the very well-known International Legion of Ukraine, which has probably hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteers from around the world fighting for Ukraine. So I would say that the contribution of foreign combatants to conflict in Ukraine has been quite significant since 2014.
Are Ukrainian paramilitary groups located primarily in southern Ukraine and Crimea? And can you talk about some of their notable activities there?
Yes, I would say we would need to distinguish between those volunteer battalions created back in 2014. Many of them re-emerged in 2022 and were subsequently incorporated into various brigades of armed forces. We need to distinguish between this sort of organized, very well structured formations, and something that I would probably call as partisan movements, which have been active on occupied territories of Kherson region in Crimea. They've been engaged in reconnaissance, intelligence gathering. They've been conducting various raids on the Russian military and the individuals who have switched sides from Ukraine to Russia ever since. So they've been quite a critical element of Ukrainian resistance since 2022 on those occupied territories, because they've passed a lot of very useful intelligence to Ukrainian security services on Russian formations on those territories, and they've also conducted quite a lot of significant assassination rates on various Russian military and civilian officials on those occupied territories. I would probably call them as partisan movements, and they're certainly less numerous than those volunteer or paramilitary formations which have been acting as part of the armed forces or as part of the forces of the Ministry of Interior, but nevertheless, they have played a very important role since 2022. They haven't really existed before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and obviously of this formation. So most of these partisan groups, support groups, they have emerged after Russia have occupied Kherson region and Zaporizhia region, and they are mostly made up of residents of those regions.
Dr. Aliyev, how active are anti-Putin paramilitary groups in the regions of Russia that border Ukraine? What have been some of their activities there? And is there cooperation between anti-Putin Russian and Ukrainian paramilitary groups?
Yes, absolutely. So the first volunteer formations made up of citizens of Russian Federation emerged early on in 2022. There is obviously a so-called RDK, which is a Russian Volunteer Corps, as well as Russian Freedom of Russia Legion. There's a number of smaller formations and battalions made up of Russian citizens. They have been relatively active from approximately 2023. Very active as well last year in 2024 on the border territories between Ukraine and Russian regions, for example, in Belgorod region and as well as in Kursk region. So in a way, they have provided a very important intelligence and reconnaissance data to the Ukrainian armed forces in the wake of the Kursk operation, which happened last year, a very successful operation by the Ukrainian armed forces. Obviously, because of the limited numbers of these individuals, they haven't been able to affect the situation on the ground to the extent that would be notable. But nevertheless, there are hundreds of these individuals, and they collaborate quite closely, not necessarily with paramilitary formations in Ukraine, but first of all with the Ukrainian security forces. Some of these Russian volunteer formations, they are part of SBU, so the security services of Ukraine. Some of them are cooperating with GUR, so military intelligence services. So they're quite firmly embedded within the security structures of Ukraine, but at the same time, some of them, and probably many of them, have a certain degree of operational and tactical autonomy, so they can make certain decisions at operational and tactical levels. And their numbers are slowly expanding, but we have to take into consideration that it is very difficult for Russian citizens to join these formations because they would need to travel to European countries, to Baltic states or to Poland, in order from these countries to travel to Ukraine and to pass through very complex identity checks, procedures before they can actually enlist into these formations, before they can become members of these Russian volunteers groups fighting on behalf of and alongside of Ukrainian armed forces.
Dr. Aliyev, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but I do have a final question. Is the pro-Putin Wagner group still actively involved in the Russian invasion against Ukraine?
Well, Wagner Group is certainly still present in occupied Ukraine, but in a different format. After the death of the founder and the leader of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, Wagner has shaped into a different format. So there's a lot of instructors, former members of Wagner, working with the members of Russian armed forces on the occupied territories. But there are also a lot of the former members of Wagner Group who are currently members of other similar so-called private military formations, such as, for example, Redout. There is a number of other similar but much smaller private military companies that Russia employs on the occupied territories, and they're very much made up of former members of Wagner Group. But certainly, Wagner doesn't exist in the same shape and form that it did, for example, in 2022 and 2023, when it was involved in this operations taking over Bakhmut and other regions in Ukraine. So it's a very different Wagner group from what we had under Prigozhin.
Dr. Aliyev, thank you so much for joining us today on Krenitsa.
Thank you very much for having me, Mike.
I have been speaking with Dr. Huseyn Aliyev, who's a senior lecturer in political and international studies at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And he's also an expert on armed conflicts in the former Soviet Union. This episode of Krenitsa has been produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krenitsa. Until next time, that's all for now.